What happens when the person you trust most is the one planning your murder? When the vows of, "till death do us part," become a literal countdown to your last breath. My name is James Patterson, and for 15 years I was invisible. I was the gardener who trimmed the hedges while million-dollar deals were made. I was the man who planted roses while secrets were buried. I was nobody, until the day I became the only thing standing between a millionaire and his own death. Welcome to What No One Told Her, where we share the stories that reveal how truth often comes from the most unexpected places. If this story moves you, please hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about attempted murder. It's about how those society overlooks are often the ones who see the most important truths. It's about moral courage and the moment when silence becomes complicity. Capitulo 1. O Mundo Perfecto. My story begins in the world of Marcus and Helena Thornfield, a world so perfect it should have been suspicious. Marcus was everything American success stories are made of, a self-made millionaire who built his empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a multinational corporation worth hundreds of millions. At 45, he was handsome in that distinguished way that comes with good suits and better breeding, his silver hair adding gravitas to board meetings where billion-dollar decisions were made with the same casualness that most people choose what to have for lunch. Helena Thornfield was his perfect complement, a woman who seemed crafted by the gods to be a millionaire's wife. At 38, she was stunning in the way that required effort but made it look effortless. Personal trainers, nutritionists, stylists, and enough cosmetic procedures to maintain the illusion that time had simply forgotten to touch her. She hosted charity galas where the wealthy convinced themselves they were making a difference, organized dinner parties where networking was disguised as friendship, and smiled for society photographers with the practiced ease of someone who understood that image was everything. Their mansion was a testament to their success, a sprawling estate that sat on 20 acres of manicured perfection in Connecticut's Gold Coast. The house itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the wealth within while keeping the world at bay. Every room was magazine-perfect, decorated by designers whose names were dropped at cocktail parties, filled with art that was purchased not for love but for status. It was the kind of home that made people feel inadequate just walking through it, which was precisely the point. And in the gardens of this paradise, invisible and unremarked, worked James Patterson. That would be me. For 15 years, I had been part of the landscape, as much a fixture as the imported Italian marble or the custom-made fountain that cost more than most people earned in a decade. I was the man who ensured that every rose bloomed perfectly, that every hedge was trimmed to mathematical precision, that the grounds provided the perfect backdrop for the Thornfield's perfect life. I was 53 years old, weathered by years of working outdoors, my hands permanently stained with soil and engine grease. I lived in a small apartment above the garage, a space that was functional but modest, a constant reminder of the vast gulf between my world and theirs. To the Thornfields' friends and associates, I was invisible, part of the help that made their lifestyle possible but whom they never actually saw as human. I had no wife, no children, no family to speak of. The gardens were my world, and maintaining them was not just my job but my passion. But invisibility, I learned, has its advantages. When people don't see you as fully human, they forget you have ears. They forget you can understand what they're saying. They forget that you might be paying attention to things that matter. For 15 years, I had been a witness to the private moments of the Thornfield marriage, the times when the perfect facade cracked and revealed what lay beneath. I had seen Marcus working 18-hour days, so consumed with building his empire that he forgot to live in it. I had watched him miss dinner after dinner, coming home when Helena was already asleep, leaving before she woke up. His idea of showing love was buying her more jewelry, taking her on more expensive vacations, expanding the house and grounds as if physical space could substitute for emotional intimacy. He loved her, I could see that, but he loved her the way a collector loves a prized painting, as something beautiful to possess and display, not as a living, breathing person with needs and desires of her own. Helena, for her part, had perfected the role of the neglected wife. She threw herself into charity work and social climbing, surrounding herself with other wealthy women who competed over who could spend more money while accomplishing less. She went to the spa 3 times a week, traveled to New York for shopping and shows, and maintained friendships that were built on mutual convenience rather than genuine affection. But I had seen her in unguarded moments, standing at her bedroom window staring out at the gardens with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made my heart ache for her. They were both prisoners of their own success, trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty from within. Marcus was addicted to achievement, always chasing the next deal, the next merger, the next milestone that would finally make him feel like he had accomplished enough. Helena was addicted to appearance, to maintaining the image of the perfect wife living the perfect life, even as that life slowly suffocated her with its emptiness. And in their beautiful, empty world, I continued to work. I planted their flowers and trimmed their bushes and maintained the illusion that their life was as perfect as their landscape. I was content with my role, or at least I told myself I was. The pay was good, the work was satisfying, and I had learned long ago not to expect more from life than a job well done and a quiet place to sleep. I was nobody special, just a gardener who happened to work for very special people. I had no idea that my position as an invisible observer would soon make me the most important person in Marcus Thornfield's life. I had no idea that the perfect world I helped maintain was about to reveal its most deadly secret. And I certainly had no idea that a woman capable of hosting charity dinners and organizing flower arrangements was also capable of planning her husband's murder with the same attention to detail she brought to planning their anniversary parties. Capitulo 2. O Observador Silencioso. Looking back now, I realize the signs were always there. I just didn't know how to read them at first. When you spend 15 years in someone's shadow, you learn to see patterns, to notice when things change, to pick up on subtleties that escape people who are too busy living their lives to examine them closely. But the changes in Helena Thornfield were so gradual, so carefully managed, that even I almost missed them. It started about 2 years ago, though I can't pinpoint the exact moment when things shifted. Helena had always been particular about her appearance, her schedule, her social commitments, but there was a new intensity to her attention to detail that felt different somehow. She began making more trips to the city, claiming they were for shopping or cultural events, but she would return from these trips with an energy that seemed more nervous than excited. She started paying more attention to Marcus's schedule, asking me casual questions about his travel plans that seemed innocent enough, but struck me as oddly specific. "James," she would say as I worked on the rose garden outside her morning room, "do you happen to know if Marcus mentioned when his next board meeting is scheduled? Or, did Marcus say anything to you about that business trip to Denver?" At first, I thought she was simply trying to be a more attentive wife, perhaps planning surprises or making sure she could coordinate their social calendar around his commitments. But there was something in her tone, a careful casualness that didn't feel quite natural. I had been invisible for so long that people forgot I was there during their most private moments. I had pruned hedges while overhearing Marcus's conference calls with his lawyers about hostile takeovers. I had weeded flower beds during dinner parties where business deals worth millions were discussed over cognac and cigars. I had witnessed arguments between Marcus and Helena about money, about time, about the growing distance between them that success seemed to create rather than bridge. But this felt different. Helena was asking questions that felt more like reconnaissance than curiosity. She wanted to know not just where Marcus would be, but when he would be there, how he would be traveling, who would be accompanying him. When I mentioned that Marcus was planning to drive himself to his quarterly board meeting upstate, something I had overheard during one of his phone calls, Helena's interest sharpened in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Drive himself?" she asked, pausing in her review of the social calendar she always kept spread across the antique writing desk in her morning room. "That's unusual, isn't it? He normally has Thompson drive him to important meetings." She was right, it was unusual. Marcus typically used his driver for business trips, preferring to work in the back seat rather than concentrate on traffic. But he had mentioned wanting to take his new Porsche for a longer drive, something about needing the time alone to think through a major acquisition that was troubling him. I had thought it was a healthy sign that Marcus was finally trying to find some balance, some space for contemplation in his relentlessly scheduled life. "He said he needed some time to think," I told Helena, not realizing I was providing information that would later take on sinister significance. "Something about wanting to clear his head before the meeting." Helena nodded thoughtfully, making a note in her calendar that seemed more detailed than a simple notation about Marcus's absence would require. "Of course," she said. "He's been under so much stress lately with the Morrison acquisition. It will be good for him to have some quiet time in the car." But I caught something in her voice, a tone that suggested she was pleased about Marcus's decision in a way that went beyond wifely concern for his well-being. It was the kind of satisfaction that comes when a plan starts falling into place, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. The phone calls began around the same time, conversations that Helena conducted in rooms she thought were private, using a voice so low I could barely make out the words even when I was working directly outside her windows. But gardens are quiet places, and sound carries in ways that people don't always expect. I began to pick up fragments of conversations that didn't seem to fit with Helena's usual social activities. "Tuesday would work better," I heard her say during one of these hushed phone conversations. "He's planning to drive alone." Another time, "You're absolutely certain it won't be traceable?" And once, in a tone so cold it made me pause in my weeding, "I don't want to hear about your conscience. We discussed this. It's too late for second thoughts now." I told myself I was misunderstanding, that I was catching these conversations out of context and assigning them meaning they didn't have. Helena was involved in numerous charitable organizations. Perhaps she was discussing some complicated fundraising scheme or dealing with a vendor who was having second thoughts about a commitment. Wealthy people lived in a world of complex arrangements that often sounded more dramatic than they actually were. But the conversations continued, and they were always held in that same careful whisper, always ended abruptly if Helena noticed me working nearby. And they were always followed by periods when Helena seemed more attentive to Marcus, more interested in his daily routines, more concerned with details about his travel plans that seemed to go far beyond normal spousal interest. I began to pay closer attention, not because I suspected anything terrible, but because something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Helena's behavior had changed, but so had the entire atmosphere of the house. There was a tension in the air that reminded me of the feeling you get before a severe thunderstorm, when the barometric pressure drops and every animal instinct you possess tells you to seek shelter. The beautiful, perfect world of the Thornfields was still beautiful and still appeared perfect, but something underneath had shifted. And I, the invisible gardener, was perhaps the only person in a position to notice. Capitulo 3. Signs Estranhos. The first concrete sign that something was seriously wrong came on a Wednesday morning in late October. I was working on the grounds maintenance schedule in the small shed where I kept my tools and equipment when I heard a car pulling into the service area behind the main house. This wasn't unusual in itself. The Thornfields regularly had service people coming and going, from pool maintenance to security system updates. But something about this visit felt different. I looked out the small window of my shed and saw a beat-up Honda Civic, the kind of car that looked distinctly out of place. On the pristine grounds of the Thornfield estate. A man got out, someone I didn't recognize, wearing coveralls that had seen better days and carrying a toolbox that looked well used rather than professionally maintained. He wasn't one of the regular service providers I knew, the ones who came in clearly marked vans with company logos and professional uniforms. What made me pay attention wasn't the man himself, but Helena's reaction to his arrival. She came out of the house immediately, as if she had been watching for him, and her body language was tense in a way I had rarely seen. She looked around nervously before approaching the stranger, checking to make sure no one was observing their interaction. For a moment, her gaze swept toward my shed, and I instinctively stepped back from the window, though I was confident she couldn't see me through the small, grimy pane of glass. Their conversation was brief, and conducted in voices too low for me to overhear, but Helena's posture throughout the exchange was rigid with anxiety. She kept glancing toward the main house, toward the driveway, toward the various points where someone might appear unexpectedly. The man seemed more relaxed, nodding occasionally and making notes in a small notebook he pulled from his back pocket. When Helena handed him what looked like a thick envelope, he tucked it away quickly and efficiently. But what happened next was what really caught my attention. Instead of heading to the front of the house where most service work was done, the man walked directly to the garage where Marcus's cars were kept. Helena produced a key and let him into the space, then remained outside, clearly standing guard. They were in there for nearly an hour, though I could hear no sounds of any work being done. No power tools, no clanging of metal on metal, none of the usual sounds that accompany automotive service. When the man finally emerged, he was carrying the same toolbox he had brought, but something about the way he held it suggested it was lighter now than when he had arrived. Helena walked him quickly back to his car, said a few final words that I couldn't hear, and watched him drive away. Then she stood in the service area for several long minutes, looking around as if making sure there was no evidence of the visit, before finally returning to the house. I tried to dismiss what I had seen, to find an innocent explanation. Perhaps Marcus had arranged for some specialized work on one of his cars and had asked Helena to coordinate the appointment. Perhaps it was related to some modification or repair that required discretion for insurance or warranty reasons. But something about Helena's behavior during the interaction felt wrong, felt secretive in a way that went beyond simple coordination of household maintenance. Over the following days, I began to notice other changes in Helena's routine. She started taking more interest in Marcus's driving habits, asking him detailed questions about his preferences for different cars, his plans for upcoming trips, his comfort level with various routes. At dinner parties, which I could sometimes overhear while working on the exterior lighting around the dining room, she would steer conversations toward topics like car safety, mechanical reliability, and the importance of regular maintenance checks. "Marcus has been working so hard lately," she said to their guests one evening, her voice carrying through the open French doors. "I worry about him driving long distances when he's tired. You read such terrible stories about accidents caused by mechanical failures." The comment seemed natural enough in context, the kind of thing a concerned wife might say, but something about the way she said it struck me as performed rather than genuine. Helena also began displaying a new interest in Marcus's business schedule, but with a focus that seemed more strategic than supportive. She would casually mention specific upcoming trips during conversations, as if testing whether the details matched what she had learned from other sources. "Didn't you say the board meeting was this Tuesday?" she would ask. "And you're planning to drive up Monday evening?" When Marcus would confirm or correct these details, Helena would nod thoughtfully, as if filing the information away for future reference. The most disturbing change was in Helena's demeanor toward Marcus himself. Their marriage had never been passionate in any obvious way, but there had always been a baseline of affection, a comfortable familiarity that spoke to years of shared life. Now, I began to notice a coldness in Helena's interactions with her husband that seemed to go beyond the normal ebbs and flows of a long marriage. She looked at Marcus sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of calculation and something that might have been anticipation. It was during this period that I began to understand that I was witnessing something significant, though I still didn't know what. Helena Thornfield, the perfect society wife, was planning something, and whatever it was required secrecy, careful timing, and detailed knowledge of her husband's routines. The beautiful world I helped maintain was developing cracks that only someone in my position could see, cracks that revealed something dark growing beneath the perfect surface. If you've ever noticed something that made you uncomfortable but couldn't quite put your finger on why, if you've ever felt like you were witnessing something important but didn't trust your own perceptions, then you know the position I found myself in. The instinct to dismiss these observations as paranoid fantasy warred with a growing certainty that I was seeing something real, something dangerous, something that demanded action I wasn't sure I was brave enough to take. Capitulo 4. A descoberta a terrorizante. The discovery that changed everything happened on a gray November morning when Marcus was away on a business trip to Chicago. Helena had left early for what she claimed was a spa day in the city, and I was alone on the property with instructions to perform routine maintenance on the cars while they were not in use. It was the kind of task I had done hundreds of times, checking fluid levels, testing battery charges, making sure that Marcus's collection of luxury vehicles remained in perfect condition for whenever he might want to use them. I started with the Bentley, then moved on to the Mercedes sedan that Helena preferred for local errands. Everything seemed normal until I reached Marcus's new Porsche 911 Turbo, the car he had been so excited about when it arrived 3 months earlier. He had described it to me in detail, explaining the engineering marvels that made it both incredibly fast and surprisingly reliable, the kind of machine that could handle both daily commuting and weekend Adventures with equal grace. But as I opened the hood to check the engine oil, something immediately struck me as wrong. The brake fluid reservoir, which should have been clear and full, looked different somehow. The fluid level was correct, but there was something about the color that didn't match what I expected to see. After 40 years of working with cars and machinery, you develop an instinct for what things should look like, and this looked wrong. I found a flashlight in the toolbox and examined the brake lines more carefully. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Someone had made a small, nearly invisible puncture in the brake line just before it connected to the front calipers. It was professional work, the kind of sabotage that would be almost impossible to detect during a casual inspection but would cause the brake fluid to leak slowly during normal driving. The brake system would function normally at first, but as the fluid level dropped, the brakes would gradually become less responsive until they failed completely. The puncture had been made with something like a small awl or ice pick, creating a tiny hole that would allow the brake fluid to escape slowly but steadily. It was positioned precisely at a point where the brake line curved around a component of the suspension system, making it nearly impossible to spot without specifically looking for it. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. I stood in that garage, flashlight in hand, staring at evidence of attempted murder, and felt my entire world shift on its axis. Helena Thornfield, the woman who hosted charity lunches and organized flower arrangements, the woman who worried publicly about her husband's safety and stress levels, had hired someone to kill Marcus by sabotaging his car. The mysterious visitor I had seen, the envelope full of money, the careful questions about Marcus's driving plans, it all suddenly made terrible, deadly sense. But understanding what I was looking at and knowing what to do about it were two completely different things. I was a gardener, a man who worked with his hands and lived quietly in the shadows of other people's dramatic lives. Who would believe me if I tried to report what I had found? Helena was respected in the community, known for her charitable work and social grace. Marcus was a prominent businessman with influence and connections. I was nobody, a man whose word would carry no weight against theirs. More immediately pressing was the question of Marcus's safety. He was due back from his business trip that evening and had mentioned his plan to drive the Porsche to his board meeting the following Tuesday. The brake sabotage had been carefully calibrated to fail during extended driving, the kind of trip that would take Marcus onto highways where a brake failure would almost certainly be fatal. The Tuesday board meeting was in Albany, a 3-hour drive that would require extensive highway travel at high speeds. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you knew something terrible was happening but felt powerless to stop it? Have you ever discovered information that you knew could save someone's life but didn't know if anyone would believe you? If this story is resonating with you, please take a moment to share it with someone else. Sometimes the most important truths come from the most unlikely sources, and sometimes a single voice of warning can make all the difference. I spent the rest of that day in a state of emotional turmoil, trying to figure out how to handle what I had discovered. Every scenario I considered seemed to end with either Marcus's death or my own complete destruction. If I said nothing, Marcus would die, and I would be complicit in his murder. If I tried to warn him, Helena would deny everything, Marcus might not believe me, and I would certainly lose my job and probably face legal consequences for making false accusations against his wife. But there was another possibility that I hadn't initially considered. I could sabotage Helena's plan without directly confronting anyone. I could repair the brake line, make it impossible for the sabotage to work, and let Helena think her plan had simply failed due to mechanical chance. It would save Marcus's life without requiring me to accuse Helena directly or put myself in legal jeopardy. Yet even this approach carried risks. If Helena discovered that her sabotage had been detected and repaired, she might try again with a method that I couldn't anticipate or prevent. And if she suspected that I was the one who had discovered and foiled her plan, I could become her next target. I had seen enough movies to know that people willing to commit murder rarely stop at just one victim if they feel threatened. As evening approached and I heard Marcus's car pulling into the driveway, I realized that I had to make a decision quickly. In less than 4 days, Marcus would get into that Porsche and drive to Albany, trusting his life to a brake system that had been designed to kill him. I was the only person who knew about the danger, and I was the only person in a position to prevent it. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. I had never asked to be anyone's savior, never wanted the kind of moral burden that comes with holding another person's life in your hands. But sometimes the universe puts you in a position where inaction becomes a choice, where silence becomes complicity, where being nobody becomes the very thing that qualifies you to be somebody's hero. Capitulo 5, O Dilemma Moral. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my small bed above the garage, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Marcus and Helena moving around in their house below. Normal sounds, doors closing, water running, the murmur of conversation that carried on the night air. The sounds of people living their lives, unaware that one of them was planning to murder the other and that their gardener knew about it. I had always been a simple man with simple moral guidelines. Work hard, treat people fairly, mind your own business, and don't cause trouble. For 15 years, these principles had served me well, allowing me to maintain steady employment and peaceful relationships with people who lived in a world vastly different from my own. But now these same principles were at war with each other, creating a moral crisis that I had no experience handling. Minding my own business meant staying silent about Helena's plot, but staying silent meant allowing Marcus to be murdered. Not causing trouble meant avoiding the confrontation that would come from accusing Helena of attempted murder, but avoiding confrontation meant being complicit in that murder. Treating people fairly meant warning Marcus about the danger he faced, but it also meant not destroying Helena's life with accusations I couldn't prove in a court of law. I got up and walked to my small window, looking down at the Porsche parked in the driveway below. In the moonlight, it looked beautiful and innocent, a masterpiece of engineering and design that represented everything positive about human achievement and ambition. But I knew that lurking beneath its hood was a tiny puncture that transformed it from a symbol of success into an instrument of death. The car was a perfect metaphor for the entire Thornfield world, beautiful on the surface, deadly underneath. The more I thought about my situation, the more I realized how perfectly Helena had planned this murder. She had chosen a method that would look like an accident, something that would generate sympathy rather than suspicion. The wealthy widow whose husband died in a tragic car crash would be an object of community support, not police investigation. She would inherit Marcus's fortune with no questions asked, free to live the life she wanted without the burden of a marriage that had clearly become more prison than partnership. But Helena had made one crucial mistake: she had forgotten that I existed. Like so many wealthy people, she had become so accustomed to treating service employees as invisible that she had literally forgotten I was there. She had conducted her clandestine meetings and made her suspicious phone calls and arranged her husband's murder, all while the gardener worked just outside her window, and it had never occurred to her that the gardener might be paying attention, might be intelligent enough to understand what he was seeing, might possess the moral courage to act on that understanding. The irony was bitter. Helena, who prided herself on her attention to detail and careful planning, had overlooked the most obvious potential witness to her crime. She had been so focused on the technical aspects of the murder, the brake sabotage, the timing, the creation of an alibi, that she had ignored the human element entirely. In her world, people like me simply didn't matter enough to consider as potential obstacles. But now I was faced with a choice that would define not just Marcus's fate, but my own character. What kind of man was I, really? Was I the simple, quiet gardener who minded his own business and avoided trouble? Or was I someone capable of taking action when action was required, regardless of the personal cost? I thought about Marcus, a man I had worked for but had never really known. He was demanding but fair, formal but not unkind. He had never treated me badly, never been deliberately cruel or condescending. He paid me well and on time, provided me with decent housing, and generally respected the boundary between employer and employee without being cold or dismissive. He didn't deserve to die, certainly not at the hands of a wife he loved and trusted. But I also thought about Helena, and despite what I had discovered about her murderous intentions, I felt a complex mix of emotions toward her. I had watched her gradual transformation from a woman who seemed merely lonely and neglected to someone capable of planning her husband's death, and I couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to such a desperate extreme. Was she simply greedy? Or was she a woman who felt trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt unbearable from within? Not that her motivations mattered when it came to the central question of right and wrong. Murder was murder, regardless of the reasons behind it, and I couldn't allow my sympathy for Helena's situation to override my obligation to prevent Marcus's death. But understanding her desperation helped me realize that this situation was more complicated than a simple case of good versus evil. As dawn approached, I found myself thinking about my own life, my own choices, my own moral failures. How many times had I stayed silent when I should have spoken up? How many times had I minded my own business when someone else's business actually mattered more? How many opportunities had I missed to be more than just the invisible gardener, to be a person who made a real difference in the world? This was my chance to matter, to be more than just a witness to other people's lives. This was my opportunity to save someone's life, to prevent a terrible crime, to prove that moral courage could be found in the most unlikely places. It didn't matter that I was just a gardener, that I had no formal education, no social standing, no connections or influence. What mattered was that I knew the truth and had the power to act on it. By the time the sun came up, I had made my decision. I couldn't repair the brake line secretly and hope that Helena would simply give up her murderous plans. I couldn't stand by and let Marcus drive unknowingly to his death. And I couldn't live with myself if I chose safety and silence over truth and action. I was going to have to find a way to warn Marcus, regardless of the consequences to myself. The only question now was how to do it in a way that he would believe and act upon, because if I failed to convince him, we would both end up victims of Helena's carefully planned revenge. Capítulo 6. A corrida contra o tempo. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November weather that makes everything look sharp and clear, as if the universe was demanding that I see the situation with perfect clarity. Marcus was scheduled to leave for Albany the following morning, which meant I had less than 24 hours to figure out how to save his life without destroying my own. The weight of that deadline pressed on me like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe normally or think clearly about my options. I had spent the weekend trying to construct a plan that would work, running through scenario after scenario in my mind and finding fatal flaws in each one. The direct approach, simply walking up to Marcus and telling him that his wife was trying to kill him, seemed most likely to backfire. He would naturally defend Helena, would assume I was either mentally unstable or trying to cause trouble for reasons of my own. Without concrete proof that he could understand and verify immediately, my word alone would carry no weight against his wife's denials and explanations. The indirect approach, anonymously reporting the brake sabotage to the police, presented its own problems. Even if the police took the reports seriously enough to investigate, Helena had positioned herself perfectly to deflect suspicion. She could claim ignorance, suggest that someone else had access to the garage, or even imply that I myself had tampered with the brakes and was now trying to frame her. As a wealthy, socially connected woman with no criminal record, she would be far more credible than a working-class gardener with no proof beyond his own observations. But as I worked in the gardens that Monday morning, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while my mind raced through increasingly desperate possibilities, I began to notice something that gave me hope. Marcus was nervous about his upcoming trip. He kept walking to his study window, which overlooked the driveway where the Porsche was parked, and staring at the car with an expression I couldn't quite read. When he came outside to check something in the garage, I could see tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there during previous business trips. "James," he said as I worked on pruning the hedge near the garage entrance, "you know cars pretty well, don't you? You've been doing maintenance on ours for years." It was more conversation than Marcus had initiated with me in months, and something in his tone suggested he was looking for reassurance about more than just mechanical expertise. "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "I've been working with cars most of my life. Learned from my father, who was a mechanic before he retired." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I've been having some concerns about the Porsche. Nothing specific, just a feeling that something isn't quite right. The brakes felt a little soft when I drove it last week, and there's been a slight pull to the left that wasn't there when it was new." My heart began racing. Marcus had already noticed symptoms of the brake sabotage, which meant the damage was more advanced than I had initially thought. The brake fluid had been leaking for longer than I realized, and the system was already beginning to fail. If he drove the car to Albany in its current condition, the brakes would almost certainly fail completely during the trip. Would you mind taking a look at it? Marcus continued. I know it's not technically part of your job description, but you seem to understand these things better than most people, and I'd value your opinion. This was the opening I had been praying for, the chance to show Marcus the evidence without having to make accusations against Helena. I could examine the brake system in front of him, point out the sabotage, and let him draw his own conclusions about how it had happened and who might be responsible. Of course, Mr. Thornfield, I said, setting down my pruning shears. I'd be happy to take a look. Would you like me to check it now? Please. I'd rather not drive all the way to Albany with any doubts about the car's safety. We walked to the garage together, and I felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that I would finally be able to show Marcus the evidence of Helena's plot, but terror about what would happen next. Even if Marcus believed me about the brake sabotage, the revelation would destroy his marriage, his trust in the woman he loved, and his faith in the perfect life they had built together. As I opened the hood of the Porsche and began examining the brake system, Marcus stood beside me, watching intently. I could feel the weight of the moment, the knowledge that what I was about to reveal would change his life forever. But I also felt the moral certainty that came with knowing I was doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Mr. Thornfield, I said carefully, shining my flashlight on the punctured brake line, I think you should look at this. Marcus leaned in closer, squinting at the area I was illuminating. At first, he didn't see what I was showing him. The puncture was so small, so carefully placed, that it took several moments of careful examination before he understood what he was looking at. Is that a hole in the brake line? He asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Yes, sir. Someone made a small puncture right here, just enough to cause a slow leak. The brake fluid has been draining out gradually. If you had driven this car on a long trip, the brakes would have failed completely, probably on the highway when you were going at high speed. Marcus stared at the sabotaged brake line for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't fully read. Confusion, anger, fear, and something that might have been dawning understanding. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes held a question that I knew I would have to answer, even though the answer would shatter his world. James, he said quietly, who else has access to this garage? The moment of truth had arrived. There was no going back now, no way to protect him from the horrible reality of what his wife had planned. I took a deep breath and prepared to tell him something that would change both of our lives forever. Capitulo 7. Don't get in that car. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Marcus and I stared at each other across the open hood of his sabotaged car. I could see his mind working, processing the implications of what I had shown him, following the logical chain of evidence to its inevitable conclusion. His face went through a series of transformations: disbelief, denial, anger, and finally, a kind of devastated acceptance that made my heart ache for him. Helena has the other key to this garage, he said quietly, not really asking a question but stating a fact he wished weren't true. Yes, sir. She's the only other person I've seen access this space in the past few months. Marcus closed his eyes and leaned against the workbench, suddenly looking older than his 45 years. How long have you known about this? I discovered it last week, when you were in Chicago. I've been trying to figure out what to do about it ever since. Why didn't you come to me immediately? It was a fair question, and one I had asked myself dozens of times over the past few days. Honestly, Mr. Thornfield, I wasn't sure you'd believe me. And I wasn't sure what proof I could offer beyond what I'd observed. Mrs. Thornfield is, well, she's your wife. She's respected in the community. I'm just the gardener. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, genuine respect mixed with profound gratitude. James, you may have saved my life. If I had driven this car to Albany tomorrow, you would have died, sir. Almost certainly. The brake failure would have happened at highway speeds, probably on a curve or during traffic that would have made it impossible to compensate for the loss of stopping power. We stood in silence for several minutes, both of us absorbing the magnitude of what we were dealing with. Marcus's wife had tried to kill him, and I, the invisible gardener, was the only reason he was still alive. The perfect world that I had helped maintain for 15 years had revealed itself to be built on a foundation of murderous deception. "I need to call the police," Marcus said finally. "Mr. Thornfield, before you do that, there's something else you should know." I told him about the mysterious visitor I had seen, about Helena's suspicious phone calls, about her careful questions regarding his travel plans. I described the gradual changes in her behavior that had led up to this moment, the way she had orchestrated not just the murder itself but all the circumstances that would make it look like an accident. Marcus listened without interruption, his face growing paler with each detail. "She planned this for months," he said when I finished. "She's been planning to kill me for months, and I never suspected anything." "I don't think she expected anyone to notice," I said. "People like Mrs. Thornfield, well, they sometimes forget that people like me are paying attention." "Thank God you were paying attention," Marcus said. "Thank God you cared enough to get involved." But our conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Through the garage window, I could see Helena's Mercedes approaching the house. She was returning from her day in the city earlier than usual, and something about her timing felt ominous. "She's back," I said unnecessarily. Marcus straightened up, and I could see him trying to compose himself, to figure out how to handle the confrontation that was now inevitable. "What do I do, James? How do I face her, knowing what I know?" "Very carefully, sir. If she realizes that her plan has been discovered, there's no telling what she might do next." We quickly closed the hood of the Porsche and walked back toward the house, trying to look casual despite the earth-shattering revelations of the past hour. Helena was just getting out of her car, carrying several shopping bags and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed her carefully laid plans were proceeding perfectly. "Marcus, darling," she called out cheerfully. "You're home early. How was your day?" "Fine," Marcus replied, his voice strained but controlled. "James was just checking the Porsche for me, making sure everything's ready for tomorrow's trip." Helena's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so briefly that someone who hadn't been watching carefully might have missed it. But I was watching very carefully indeed, and I saw the flicker of concern that crossed her face before the perfect mask slipped back into place. "That's wonderful," she said, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. "I'm so glad James is taking such good care of our cars. You can never be too careful about mechanical safety, especially on long highway trips." The casual reference to mechanical safety made my skin crawl. Here was a woman discussing safety concerns about a car she had personally sabotaged, expressing worry about the very danger she had created. The performance was flawless, the kind of Oscar-worthy deception that comes from months of careful practice. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, "James found something interesting when he was checking the brakes. Something I think you should see." Helena's composure slipped again, more noticeably this time. "Oh, what kind of something? Why don't we go look at it together?" Marcus suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "I'd be interested in your opinion about what might have caused it." For the first time since I had known her, Helena Thornfield looked genuinely frightened. She glanced quickly between Marcus and me, trying to assess how much we knew and how much danger she was in. The perfect society wife facade was beginning to crack, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. I really should put these packages away first," she said, clutching her shopping bags like a shield. "Maybe we could look at it later, after dinner?" "I think we should look at it now," Marcus said firmly, "before I decide whether it's safe to drive to Albany tomorrow." The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Helena was calculating her options, trying to figure out if there was still a way to salvage her plan or escape the consequences of discovery. Marcus was gathering his courage to confront the woman he loved with evidence of her betrayal. And I was preparing to become a witness to the moment when a marriage built on 15 years of shared life was destroyed by the revelation of murderous intent. The reckoning had arrived, and there would be no going back for any of us. Capitulo 8. A Verdade Revelada. What happened next was something I will never forget as long as I live. Helena's carefully constructed facade didn't just crack, it shattered completely, revealing something dark and desperate underneath that was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. "You want to see what James found?" Marcus asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Then let's all go to the garage together." Helena's composure finally broke. Her shopping bags fell from her hands, expensive items scattering across the driveway as she took several steps backward, her face cycling through expressions of panic, rage, and calculation. "I don't know what he's told you," she said, her voice no longer the cultured tone of a society wife but something raw and desperate. "But you can't trust him. He's just a gardener, Marcus. He's probably trying to get attention, or money, or—" "Then you won't mind looking at what he found," Marcus interrupted. "If James is lying, it should be easy to prove." But Helena was beyond rational argument now. The woman who had spent months planning her husband's murder with cold precision was suddenly faced with the collapse of her perfect plan, and the shock was transforming her into someone I barely recognized. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to something close to a shriek. "You don't understand what my life has been like, married to you. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I chose to become invisible in my own marriage?" Marcus stared at his wife, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "Helena, what are you talking about?" "You!" she screamed, pointing at him with a trembling finger. "I'm talking about you and your precious company and your 18-hour days and your complete inability to see me as anything more than an accessory to your success." The words came pouring out of her now, 20 years of resentment and rage that had been building beneath the perfect surface. She told us about the loneliness, about the nights she had sat alone in their beautiful house waiting for a husband who never came home. She talked about the social humiliation of constantly making excuses for Marcus's absence at events she had organized. She described the slow death of hope as she realized that Marcus would never love her as much as he loved his business. "I tried everything," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I tried being the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect social accessory. I tried supporting your career, making our home beautiful, maintaining your public image. But none of it mattered, did it? You were never really there anyway." Marcus looked stricken, as if he was seeing the pain he had caused for the first time. "Helena, if you were unhappy, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you ask for a divorce?" Helena's laugh was harsh and bitter. "A divorce? And give up everything I've worked for? Do you think I wanted to go back to being nobody? I had a life before I married you, Marcus. I had dreams, ambitions, plans of my own. But I gave them all up to be your wife, and after 20 years, this life is all I have left. So you decided to kill me?" "I decided to be free," Helena said, her voice growing cold again. "Free from a marriage that was already dead, free to live the life I deserved, free from pretending that I didn't hate every minute of this perfect prison we built together." The confession hung in the air between us, as shocking for its honesty as for its content. Helena wasn't just a greedy woman who had married for money. She was someone who had slowly been destroyed by a loveless marriage and had finally chosen murder as her escape route. "I hired someone to sabotage your car," she continued, as if the admission was somehow liberating. "It was supposed to look like an accident, a tragic loss that would make me a sympathetic widow rather than a desperate divorcee. I planned every detail, every alibi, every emotional response I would need to perform." Marcus was looking at his wife, as if he had never seen her before. "How long have you been planning this?" "Months. Since you announced that acquisition deal that would keep you traveling constantly for the next 2 years. I realized that I could live for decades more in this beautiful, empty life, watching you love your company more than you could ever love me." "But the gardener saw," Marcus said quietly, looking at me with something that might have been wonder. Helena's gaze shifted to me, and for the first time, she really saw me as a person rather than part of the landscape. "James," she said, and her voice held a mixture of rage and something that might have been respect. "The invisible man who saw everything." I nodded slowly. "I did see everything, Mrs. Thornfield. And I couldn't let it happen." "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. What did you care what happened to us? It was a fair question, and one I had asked myself many times over the past week. Because murder is wrong, I said simply. And because Mr. Thornfield didn't deserve to die for the crime of working too hard. Helena stared at me for a long moment, then began to laugh. It was not a sound of amusement, but something close to hysteria. The gardener has more moral clarity than either of us, she said to Marcus. The man we treated as invisible is the only one who could see clearly. Marcus pulled out his phone. I'm calling the police. Yes, Helena said, her voice suddenly calm again. I suppose you should. As Marcus dialed 911, Helena looked around the beautiful grounds that had been her prison for so many years. You know what the truly ironic part is? She said to no one in particular. If you had just paid attention to me, if you had just seen me as a person instead of a beautiful object, none of this would have happened. She was right, of course. But that didn't change the fact that she had chosen murder over honesty, death over divorce, violence over simply walking away from a life that was making her miserable. The police arrived within minutes, and Helena Thornfield was arrested for attempted murder. As they led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at the mansion one final time, and I thought I saw something like relief in her eyes. Capitulo 9, O Verdadero Valor. 6 months later, I was still living above the garage at what was now just Marcus Thornfield's estate, though everything about the place had changed. The perfect gardens remained perfectly maintained, the beautiful house still gleamed with expensive elegance, but the oppressive atmosphere of secrets and unspoken resentments was gone, replaced by something that felt more honest, more real. Helena had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder and conspiracy. The trial had been a media sensation, with journalists dissecting every detail of the case and turning it into a cautionary tale about the dark side of wealth and privilege. But Marcus had handled it all with a dignity that surprised me, refusing to demonize his wife publicly while also acknowledging the severity of what she had tried to do. She was right about one thing, he told me during one of our regular conversations as we worked together in the garden. I was so focused on building my empire that I forgot to build a marriage. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it explains why she felt driven to such desperate measures. Marcus had changed more than the house had. The driven, obsessive businessman who worked 18-hour days had evolved into someone more thoughtful, more present, more interested in the people around him than just the deals he could make with them. He still ran his company, but he had delegated much of the day-to-day operations to trusted executives, choosing to focus on the bigger picture rather than every microscopic detail. More importantly, he had learned to see me as more than just the gardener. Our shared experience of Helena's betrayal had created a bond between us that transcended the traditional employer-employee relationship. We talked regularly about everything from business strategy to philosophy, and Marcus often sought my opinion on matters that had nothing to do with landscape maintenance. You saved my life, he said to me one evening as we sat on the terrace, overlooking the gardens I had spent 15 years perfecting. But more than that, you saved my soul. You showed me what moral courage looks like. I disagreed with his assessment. I just did what anyone would have done in my position. No, Marcus said firmly. Most people would have minded their own business, would have found reasons not to get involved. You risked everything to save someone you barely knew, someone who had never treated you as more than hired help. It was true that Marcus had never been deliberately unkind to me, but he also hadn't seen me as fully human until the moment when I became the person standing between him and death. The experience had taught both of us something important about the invisible people who make our comfortable lives possible. Marcus had instituted changes throughout his company, implementing policies that ensured every employee felt valued and respected regardless of their position in the corporate hierarchy. He had also established a foundation dedicated to supporting working-class families and individuals who often went unnoticed by the wealthy people whose lives they helped maintain. I spent 20 years building wealth, he explained to me. Now I want to spend the rest of my life building something that actually matters. The foundation had started small, but it was growing rapidly, funded by Marcus's genuine desire to make amends for the years he had spent ignoring the people who made his success possible. We worked together on many of the foundation's projects, with Marcus providing the funding and connections while I helped identify the families and individuals who would benefit most from the assistance. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Marcus approached relationships. He had started dating someone new, a woman named Sarah who worked as a social worker and who valued kindness over wealth, substance over style. She was nothing like Helena in appearance or background, but she was everything Helena had never been: genuine, unpretentious, and capable of seeing Marcus as a person rather than a bank account. "I'm learning what it means to be in a relationship with someone who actually knows me," Marcus told me after he and Sarah had been dating for several months. "Not the public version of me, not the wealthy businessman version, but the real person underneath all of that." Sarah had also changed the dynamics of the household in ways that I hadn't expected. She treated me as an equal from the moment she met me, asking my opinion about everything from garden design to social justice initiatives. She was the kind of person who naturally saw the humanity in everyone she encountered, regardless of their social status or economic position. "James," she said to me during one of her visits, "Marcus tells me you're interested in criminal justice reform. Would you consider speaking at one of our foundation events about your experience? I think people need to hear your story." The idea of speaking publicly about what I had witnessed and done terrified me, but Sarah's encouragement and Marcus's support helped me find the courage to share my story. I began speaking at foundation events, at community colleges, at social work conferences, telling audiences about the importance of paying attention to the people around us and having the courage to act when action is required. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to share their own stories of times when they had witnessed something wrong and struggled with whether to get involved. My experience had resonated with something universal: the moral dilemma that faces anyone who discovers uncomfortable truths about the people around them. Looking back now, I realize that Helena's plot to kill Marcus had destroyed one kind of life but created the possibility for something better. Marcus had learned to value people over profit. I had discovered that my voice mattered, and together we were working to build something that would help other invisible people feel seen and valued. If this story has reminded you of someone in your life who might be invisible to you, someone whose contribution you might take for granted, I urge you to reach out to them. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that every person has value, that every voice matters, that sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected sources. My name is James Patterson, and for 15 years I was nobody. But on one Monday morning, when I discovered evidence of attempted murder and found the courage to speak up, I learned that being nobody doesn't mean you can't be somebody's hero. Sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary courage, and sometimes saving someone else's life is the thing that finally makes your own life matter. The beautiful gardens at the Thornfield estate are still beautiful, still perfectly maintained. But now they're tended by someone who knows that his work matters not just because it creates beauty, but because it's part of a life lived with purpose, courage, and the knowledge that every person, no matter how invisible they might seem, has the power to change the world.